Hello, I'm Jonasz Lewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. They served the regime, and then they fell from windows. Since 2022, Russia's top officials, spies and energy barons have died in a parade of accidents too chilling to ignore. What looks like suicide and coincidence may in fact be the internal nervous system of a collapsing empire, using murder as a message. On this episode, we dive into Putin's paranoid purge of the Kremlin's own inner circle and what it reveals about the state of the Russian regime. Because when a system turns on itself, the cracks are no longer deniable. And though this story may not be taking place on the battlefield, the corridors of power are piling up with bodies. So without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
A mysterious death has taken place in Russia. Former Transportation Minister Roman Starovoyt was found dead with a gunshot wound just hours after he was dismissed by Vladimir Putin. He had held the position for just over a year. Starovoyt's replacement was voted in immediately just earlier this week.
In favor, 408. Against, 0. Abstentions, 0. The decision is adopted unanimously. Andrei Sergeyevich Nikitin is approved as Minister of Transport of the Russian Federation.
An investigation into the death is currently pending. The former minister's body was found near his Tesla in one of Moscow's upscale suburbs. The Kremlin itself says it is shocked by the death. Government spokesperson Dmitry Peskov says Vladimir Putin is to be notified, but other than that has not offered to comment on the matter. Both Starovoyt's death and his dismissal have been the matter of widespread speculation. There have been rumors that he was facing criminal prosecution as part of an ongoing investigation into alleged corruption involving the defenses of the Kursk region. Prior to serving in his capacity as Minister of Transportation, Starovoyt was the governor of the Kursk region between 2018 and 2024. This means that he held the position when the Ukrainian army breached the border and launched a surprise counteroffensive into the area. Russian media previously reported that the border defenses in the region cost close to $200 million to build and took almost 3 years to finish. Despite this apparent effort, the Ukrainians had been able to overcome the defenses with relative ease.
And now we're zoning in on the explaining portion of our show. Russia has a long history of different traditions. One of them, however, is quite recent and involves disgraced politicians or opposition figures falling out of windows once they've become bothersome to the government.
The sudden and mysterious death of former Transportation Minister Roman Starovoyt is not the first of its kind, far from it. For years, Russia has been plagued, let's say, with dozens such cases. Since the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, however, they have intensified. They very often are either framed as suicides or are otherwise reported as borderline unexplainable. These incidents, more often than not, concern members of the Russian political and economic elite. Gazprom executives, oligarchs linked to economic powerhouses like Lukoil and Transneft, all of them have met very similar ends in recent years. All of them serve as a warning and as a constant reminder: obey or face the consequences. In many of these cases, the officials and executives had either failed in some regard in relation to the Russian government or outright in opposition against ideas put forward by Russian leadership. Many in the West joke about falling out of windows being an epidemic in Russia, but it all goes to show just how brutal the power struggle in Moscow can be.
And now it's time to explore the issue in greater detail, so let's begin. Since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine began in 2022, at least 20 high-level Russian officials, intelligence operatives and executives have died under suspicious circumstances. They've fallen out of windows, collapsed from sudden heart attacks, died mysteriously abroad, or been found hanged, poisoned, or accidentally shot. If this sounds like a pattern, that's because it is. These aren't random events or personal tragedies. These are eliminations. What we're witnessing is a silent purge, an internal war waged by the Kremlin, not just to survive the war in Ukraine, but to maintain the integrity of its increasingly paranoid regime. In the last 3 years, those who've died have included retired SVR generals, deputy governors, defense-linked technocrats, and oil executives with access to sensitive infrastructure. Some were facing audit investigations, others were believed to be quietly critical of the war. All had one thing in common: they were insiders. And in a system built on secrecy, silence and fear, being an insider is an increasingly dangerous place to be. This isn't Stalin's 1937. There are no show trials, no public purges, but make no mistake, this is repression by other means. What analysts now call silent repression serves four key functions for the Kremlin. Containment of intelligence leaks, which means eliminating those with sensitive knowledge and war on corruption. It's also keeping elite disciplined, reminding all others that loyalty is expected and retirement is no escape. Such actions also promote deterrence. Especially in the wake of the Wagner mutiny, the message was clear. Even silent disobedience will be punished. And finally, there is narrative control. Dead men don't leak, write memoirs, or talk to Western intelligence. Think of it as Putin's post-Prigozhin cleanup. After the Wagner's boss's dramatic assassination back in 2023, the Kremlin turned inward, targeting not just paramilitaries, but administrators, technocrats, even regional apparatchiks suspected of wavering. Some of these deaths are about logistics. Individuals tied to failed procurement programs, battlefield losses, or budget scandals are wiped off the board to protect the image of competence. Others are personal. Power struggles between the factions, security, military, and law enforcement. And they play out in what can only be described as elite assassinations dressed up as coincidence. But perhaps the most chilling is the possibility that this isn't a one-off campaign, but a model of governance. This is why these killings often go uninvestigated. Why the Russian media parrots the suicide story before autopsies even begin, and why no one ever resigns and no one ever talks. These deaths tell us that Putin's regime is no longer just authoritarian, it is predatory, feeding on itself to survive. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Paul Goebel, Senior Fellow at the Jamestown Foundation. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you for having me.
So, when you first heard about the death of Mr. Roman Starovoyt, what was your impression? Does it actually tell us anything beyond the headlines? Anything about the inner workings of the system in Russia in particular?
Well, Mr. Putin has understood that not only will most journalists in Russia and elsewhere follow whatever is published in the official press of the Russian Federation, but also that if you impose controls gradually, people will get used to everything and won't take it as so exceptional that they need to look into it more deeply. If Mr. Putin had suddenly arrested and had killed 20 or 25 of his opponents, the international community and the international journalist fraternity would have examined things very, very quickly and closely. But because he's done it slowly, people have gotten used to it. And so what will happen is that either people will accept the suicide narrative, which Mr. Putin's regime is putting out, or they will simply look away. Either way, Mr. Putin wins. And it's terribly important to recognize that we are moving into a new system in Russia, one away from a kind of stable autocracy into a militant and more totalitarian country that is quite willing to kill its opponents as well as to engage in aggression abroad.
So what you're saying is essentially that in terms of media coverage, Putin is actually using the frog boiling tactic. Without doing anything too sudden or too abrupt, things actually get accepted, and he actually gets this sort of acquiescence, except for those who obviously are able to look beyond what's on the surface, right?
He's done that in all of his policy areas. After all, he invaded Georgia in 2008, and after a year or so, the international community came to terms with that. In 2014, he seized Crimea and part of the Donbass from Ukraine, and the international community was upset, but came to terms. Then he moved further in 2022, and now we have politicians in many Western countries saying, well, it's time to look beyond Ukraine. We have too many important things that we need to talk to the Russians about. And so Mr. Putin is dosing it out slowly moving in the direction of a totalitarian state. But we need to recognize that, because the next steps may be far more horrific, both at home and abroad.
And by saying they might actually be much worse than what we're seeing at home, because when it comes to external signals, well, Putin has hardly been very subtle. He's actually launched 700 drones at Ukraine during the night earlier today. But internally, what could actually be worse than what we've already seen recently?
Well, what can be worse is if the Duma passes a bill that his government has proposed that will give the FSB near total control over the judicial system, that will require the railroads of the country to add special cars all the time to deport people to a restored gulag. I think we would say that's worse. That's moving from perhaps where Stalin was in 1930 to where Stalin was in 1935. And we are moving fast in one way, but just slow enough that your analogy about the frog story is exactly right. The water is heating up. People should be paying attention to that. Clearly, the officials in Russia are. They're afraid. And it's a situation where Putin may even get people to commit suicide when they're put in a bad position. If committing suicide is a less horrific fate than staying alive and being put in one of Putin's torture chambers.
So now, we've already seen Putin having opposition leaders assassinated, like the Nemtsov case, later on Mr. Navalny. But what about the assassinations or the so-called suicides? The jury is still out on that one, obviously, especially in the case that we're talking about today, which are directed against members, if not of the inner circle, then at least people who are insiders of the system. Does it tell us simply that he's trying to consolidate power, or that there are perhaps some sort of inner factional wars taking place, like the FSB and the military taking on one another, trying to blame one another for the failings in the course of the current war?
What Mr. Putin is doing is trying to set very, very clear limits on how much disagreement there can be, even within his own regime. In the past, we saw a great deal of disagreement within the Putin regime between these various factions you point to. Now Mr. Putin has decided, I don't want that anymore, and I don't have to put up with it, so I'm going to go after my own. No one can be allowed to feel secure enough that they can say whatever they want. They have to worry always about what I want. And that is a change and a movement away from an authoritarian model to a totalitarian one.
So would you say that this is going to produce the desired results, or will that perhaps prompt some of the actors still present and still following their own interests in Russia itself to take some sort of action? Is everyone going to be on board with that, to put it simple?
Well, a lot of people are going to be unhappy, but the problem of opposing it is that it almost always requires that you talk to a group of people, and that you talk to the right group of people. Every time you talk to another person, there is a great risk that the FSB or someone else will report it to Putin, and you'll be in trouble. It's very difficult to organize a conspiracy when the exact boundaries of the political elite are not known. Nikita Khrushchev was ousted because the opponents of Mr. Khrushchev knew exactly whom they had to recruit, a majority of the Politburo. There is no Politburo now. Whom do you recruit? How many do you have to get? And every time you try to recruit someone to your point of view that this man needs to be stopped and ousted, you put yourself at greater risk. So Mr. Putin has a certain insurance policy because of that. And his deinstitutionalization of Russian politics makes everyone who might oppose him that much more unsure of whom they would need to get on their side to be able to effectively challenge the Kremlin leader.
And you're right. I mean, look at Mr. Prigozhin, for example. That was one of the most audacious cases of mutiny, followed by another accident.
Yes, well, I don't think anyone would have wanted to be the person to sell life insurance to Mr. Prigozhin after he led his revolt. That revolt showed that Mr. Putin's regime had a lot less support within its own ranks than most people had thought, and I think that this was a murder ordered by Putin just as much as Navalny or Nemtsov. This is a man who's not afraid to use the ultimate sanction against his opponents.
So, how resilient is that regime? Some people think it is a glass cannon, but then again, how many predictions did we have in the very early stages of the war that, if Putin goes ahead, the oligarchs are going to rebel, they will not want their interests to be damaged by the curtailment of trade with the European Union and all that. That didn't happen, did it? So, would you say that, in fact, this regime is simply, there to stay, whatever happens?
Well, this regime is probably there to stay until Mr. Putin leaves this earth. I think that he is in solid control. Right now, it would take an assassination. The number of people who could conduct that is very small, and Mr. Putin has protected himself against it. That doesn't mean that everyone is happy with what he's doing. You see rumblings. If you follow the Russian media, what you see is that there's a great deal of disagreement. But it is kept below the radar screen. It's very quiet. It's always an attempt to say, we're doing the right thing. We just need to do a little more of this or a little less of that. And as long as that's the case, Mr. Putin's regime will remain stable as long as he's alive.
And if Vladimir Putin leaves this earth by means which are not natural, is it more likely that it's going to be an insider doing this or some sort of intelligence operation conducted from outside? Also, would you say that for the time being there is this sort of tacit agreement between the major powers that you simply cannot move on a major leadership figure like Putin? If Ukraine, for example, wanted to do that, they would be stopped by the intelligence of its allies, because there were signals suggesting that somehow at some point.
I can't imagine that anybody abroad is going to do any move against Putin in that way. I think that if a move comes, it will come from within. The consequences of any foreign move the likelihood of any foreign move being successful is very, very small, and the certainty that if it were conducted, it would bring to power a regime that might be even more hostile, even more nasty to its foreign partners and to Russian citizens than Mr. Putin has been. There would be a natural desire of the successor generation to present itself as the defender of Putin's legacy and therefore be even tougher. So I think that looking abroad is almost certainly a mistake. I don't think the Ukrainians want to do it either, and for the same reasons. And so I would expect that if there is such a challenge of that kind, it would come from within. And I think Mr. Putin is doing what he can as a FSB officer to make sure that doesn't happen either.
Paul Goebel was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you.
And now, moving on to Eastern Newsflash, a curated selection of all the other stories from the East that you absolutely don't want to miss. Russia has taken a very controversial step when it comes to plugging gaps in its army ranks. Vladimir Putin recently signed a decree which permits foreigners to serve in the Russian army during periods of mobilization.
Russia's ability to continue to wage its war in Ukraine boils down to the number of boots it can put on the ground. Russian doctrine is heavily focused on beating their enemy of superior numbers. There have been reports of Russia supposedly pressuring foreign nationals living in the country to join the war effort, but it has now opened a new avenue for them to sign up. This is meant to help recuperate losses on the front while not causing a wave of public unrest due to conscription which is unpopular across the country. For example, just in March, Putin authorized a conscription of 160,000 men. Although Russian authorities claim conscripts aren't sent to the front, human rights groups and relatives say many are pressured into signing fully fledged army contracts.
Due to the pressure inflicted on Ukraine's gas reserves by Russian attacks, the country has been faced with an energy crisis. There may be a light at the end of the tunnel, however, as Naftogaz has brought a new high-yield gas well online.
Ukraine's state energy company Naftogaz has reportedly commissioned a new gas exploration well, which produces some 380,000 cubic meters of the resource per day. The well has apparently been drilled and commissioned 6 weeks ahead of schedule, as Ukrainian authorities are scrambling to boost domestic production amid ongoing Russian attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure. Naftogaz is responsible for the lion's share of Ukraine's gas production. The problem is that its facilities were severely damaged in a series of Russian missile strikes earlier this year, and production has plummeted by as much as 40%. In addition to new wells, to remedy this issue, Naftogaz has also been signing contracts with foreign suppliers, such as Poland's state-owned Orlen, for gas deliveries. According to a Bloomberg report, Ukraine may import a record 5 billion cubic meters of gas from Europe in 2025.
Ukraine's military intelligence has published a directive by a Russian general concerning Russian troop deployment to Armenia. Yerevan previously denied reports that such a deployment was taking place.
Earlier this month, Armenia refuted Ukrainian claims that there was a Russian troop buildup within its borders. The Armenian Foreign Ministry referred to the country's position against permitting third countries to use its territory for hostilities against other nations. The Ukrainian side later responded by publishing a telegram message from Russian Major General Serhiy Zemskov. The document allegedly contains an explicit order to reinforce the Russian military base in Gyumri, Armenia, through, quote, additional staffing. This base was established in 1995 under an agreement between Moscow and Yerevan and is to last until 2044. Relations between Armenia and Russia collapsed in the wake of the latter's inaction as Yerevan's arch-rival Azerbaijan captured the Nagorno-Karabakh region in 2023. Since then, Armenia has been courting both the United States and the European Union in efforts to diversify its partnership portfolio.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.